On an autumn afternoon in 1999, 13-year-old Caleb Thompson vanished from the quiet streets of Pinewood, Oregon, a small town nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. His mother, Eleanor Thompson, was left with only grief and whispers that local police might be involved. For 22 years, she chased every lead, haunted by the question of what happened to her son. Then, in 2021, a park ranger's discovery of a buried duffel bag in the mountains revealed a red Portland Trail Blazers jersey with Caleb's name, a clue that would unravel a conspiracy someone had killed to conceal. Eleanor Thompson began each morning with a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. She pressed her palm against the glass frame of a photograph on her bedside table, where her son, Caleb, forever 13, grinned in his red Trail Blazers jersey, a basketball cradled under his arm. "Good morning, my heart," she whispered, her voice thick with 22 years of longing. "Mom's still here, still fighting for you." Her modest home on Maple Street was a testament to her loss. Caleb's bedroom remained untouched since that October morning in 1999 when he'd left for school. Comic books lay open on his desk, posters of NBA stars like Clyde Drexler and Shaquille O'Neal faded on the walls, and a pair of scuffed sneakers waited by the door. Eleanor dusted the room weekly, changed his sheets monthly, as if preserving it might bring him back. In the kitchen, she passed a cork board covered with yellowed missing person flyers. Caleb Thompson, age 13, last seen October 12, 1999, and a cardboard box overflowing with police reports she'd memorized. The uncertainty of Caleb's fate was a wound that never closed, more painful than any truth could be. "Lord, if you're listening," she prayed, clutching a chipped ceramic mug Caleb had painted for her at a school art fair, its blue handprints nearly worn away. "Please, show me what happened to my boy." 10 miles away, Daniel Rivera adjusted his ranger gear and leashed his German shepherd, Luna, for a patrol through the Cascade Mountains. The air was crisp, with pine and damp earth, a welcome change from his desk job analyzing soil samples for the U.S. Forest Service. These weekend treks were his sanctuary, a chance to escape the monotony of reports and breathe freely. Luna bounded ahead on the Mackenzie River Trail, her nose low, chasing invisible scents. "Stay close, girl," Daniel called, as she darted into a thicket of ferns. Her sudden, urgent barking cut through the forest's silence, not her usual playful yip. "What's got you so worked up?" Daniel pushed through the underbrush and found Luna digging at a patch of earth blanketed in pine needles. He knelt, brushing away debris to reveal the frayed corner of a canvas duffel bag, its fabric weathered, zippers rusted green. His training as a former crime scene technician kicked in. He snapped photos with his phone, documenting the scene before disturbing it. With careful hands, he freed the bag from the soil, its weight heavy with secrets. The zippers resisted, then gave way with a gritty rasp, revealing clothes wrapped in brittle plastic, jeans, a t-shirt, and a red Trail Blazers jersey. Daniel lifted the jersey, and a tag inside the collar crinkled, marked in faded ink. Caleb Thompson, 142 Maple Street, Pinewood, Oregon. His heart sank. This wasn't trash. Someone had labeled this jersey, cared about the boy it belonged to. The deliberate burial suggested a crime, hidden where few would look. Daniel sealed the jersey in a Ziploc bag from his pack, treating it like evidence. The drive back to Pinewood was a blur, the jersey on the passenger seat a silent demand for answers. Maple Street was a quiet stretch of modest homes, where neighbors still waved from their porches. Number 142 was tidy, its front yard bursting with wildflowers and a faded American flag hanging by the door. An older woman, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a bun, was pruning roses with slow precision, finding solace in routine. Daniel approached, the jersey tucked under his arm. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Eleanor Thompson? Do you know a Caleb Thompson?" Eleanor's pruning shears slipped, clattering onto the stone path. Dirt scattered as her eyes locked on the red fabric. "That's my son's jersey," she gasped, her legs wobbling. She gripped the porch railing, her face drained of color. "Where did you find it? Please, tell me. Did you find my boy?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as 22 years of hope and despair collided. Daniel steadied her gently. "Ma'am, let's sit down and talk." Inside her living room, a shrine to Caleb covered one wall. Photos from his first steps to his last school picture. Little League trophies, spelling bee ribbons, candles burned low from countless vigils. A faded Pinewood Gazette clipping was pinned up. Local boy, 13, missing. Police suspect, runaway. Eleanor sank onto the couch, clutching the jersey. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice wavering between command and plea. "Every detail about where you found this." Daniel sat across from her, pulling out his phone to show the photos. "I found it buried about 2 feet down in the Cascades, near the Mackenzie River Trail. The duffel bag was old, packed with other clothes, jeans, a t-shirt. But this jersey stood out because of the tag, with Caleb's name and address." Eleanor traced the faded writing with her fingertip, fresh tears spilling. "I taught him to write his name on everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I'd say, if you lose something, this'll help it find its way back. Never thought." She couldn't finish, her breath catching in a sob. "Mr. Rivera, how long has Caleb been missing?" Daniel hesitated, sensing the weight of her question. "How long has it been for you, Mrs. Thompson?" 22 years, 3 months, and 12 days, she said, the precision revealing her pain. "But he's not missing. Missing means we don't know what happened. Someone took my boy. Someone killed him, and I don't know who." She stood abruptly, moving to a closet and returning with a cardboard box stuffed with files. Police reports, witness statements, maps marked with colored pins, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. "I've been investigating since the day he disappeared," she said, spreading documents across the coffee table with practiced efficiency. "The police gave up after 2 weeks, but I never stopped. I've knocked on doors, called tip lines, followed every lead. Nothing." Daniel studied the documents, impressed by her thoroughness. "Tell me about that day," he said gently. Eleanor's breath hitched, and she was back in her kitchen, October 12th, 1999. "Caleb left for school wearing this jersey," she began, her voice trembling. "He had basketball tryouts after class, so excited he could barely eat his toast." "Mom, think I'll make the team?" he asked, dribbling his basketball in the hallway, even though I told him 100 times not to. She smiled faintly, the memory bittersweet. "He wanted to play for the Trailblazers someday, like Clyde Drexler." He kissed my cheek, grabbed his backpack, and said, "Love you, Mom. I'll be home by 6. I told him to come straight home after practice. He promised he would." Her voice broke, and she collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "He promised, Mr. Rivera. Caleb always kept his promises. My boy never came home." Daniel's heart ached for her. "What did the police investigation find?" "Nothing," Eleanor spat, 22 years of frustration exploding. Officers Carl Mitchell and Thomas Hayes spent 2 weeks looking before deciding he was a runaway. Said he probably got mixed up with troublemakers or drugs. They didn't know my son. Caleb was an A student, a good kid, always helping at church. They didn't even try to know him. She pulled out a stack of witness statements written in her careful handwriting. I did my own investigation, talked to everyone who saw Caleb that day. His friend Ethan was the last to see him around 3:30, walking toward the bus stop on Main Street. Mrs. Larson, who ran the corner store, thought she saw him around 4 o'clock, talking to someone near a car. But it was getting dark, and she couldn't be sure. "Did anyone else see him?" Daniel asked, leaning forward. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. A few neighbors mentioned police cars in the area that afternoon, but that wasn't unusual in Pinewood. Mrs. Carter, who lived across the street, heard raised voices around 4:15, but didn't see anything. "I followed every lead," Mr. Rivera. "Talked to kids from school, shopkeepers, even some rough types hanging out by the old mill. Nobody knew anything. It's like my boy vanished into thin air." She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "But now we know he didn't just vanish. This jersey proves it." She stood, walking to Caleb's photograph on the shrine, touching the glass with trembling fingers. "For 22 years, I've had nightmares about what happened to him. Was he scared? Did he call for me? Did he suffer? Not knowing who took him. Why? It's been eating me alive." Her voice broke completely. "Every night, I promise his picture, I'll find out what happened. Every morning, I wake up, and I'm still failing him." "You haven't failed him," Daniel said firmly. "You've spent 22 years searching for the truth. This investigation you've done, it's more thorough than most police work I've seen." Eleanor wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. "And now, we have something they can't ignore. We have proof Caleb's gone, and we have a location." She turned to Daniel, determination replacing despair. "Mr. Rivera, will you help me find out who killed my son?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said. "We're going to find the truth." Eleanor spent 3 sleepless nights researching before choosing Detective Laura Bennett, a cold case specialist with the Oregon State Police. Bennett had a reputation for solving a missing girls case in nearby Salem when others had given up. "I know who you are," Eleanor said, settling into a chair across from Bennett's desk, Daniel beside her with the jersey. "My friend Clara told me how you found her niece's killer. I need that kind of help." Bennett studied Eleanor's determined but exhausted face. "Mrs. Thompson, you called about new evidence in your son's case." "That's right." Eleanor placed a thick folder on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. "I need you to understand something, Detective. I've been investigating Caleb's disappearance for 22 years, and I still don't know who killed my boy." The admission hung in the air, raw and painful. She opened the folder, revealing meticulously organized documents, photocopied police reports, witness statements in her neat handwriting, maps with locations marked in colored pens, clippings from the Pinewood Gazette. "I was a librarian for 30 years before I retired," she said, her voice wavering between pride and desperation. "I know how to keep records, but all this work, and I can't tell you who murdered my son or why." Daniel unwrapped the jersey. "Detective, I found this buried in the Cascade Mountains, along with other clothes. The tag has Caleb's name and address." Bennett pulled on latex gloves and examined the jersey, noting the faded but legible writing. "How long do you estimate this has been buried?" 22 years, Eleanor whispered, fresh tears starting. "The same 22 years I've been going crazy, not knowing what happened to him." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Detective, I need you to understand what this feels like. Every day for 22 years, I've wondered if the person who killed Caleb is someone I pass on the street, someone who shops at my grocery store, someone who sits next to me at church." Bennett set the jersey down carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, what was the original investigation like?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "What investigation?" Officers Carl Mitchell and Thomas Hayes spent 2 weeks before deciding Caleb was a runaway. Said he probably joined a gang or got into drugs. They didn't know my boy. They didn't even try. Her voice hardened with old anger. "Mitchell told me to my face that boys like Caleb usually end up in trouble anyway. Like my son was guilty just for being born." Bennett's expression darkened. "That's completely inappropriate. Do you remember anything else about their handling of the case?" They treated me like a nuisance, Eleanor said. Every time I called for updates, Hayes would sigh like I was wasting his time. I kept pushing, but they closed the case, said there were no leads. So I started my own investigation. She pointed to the documents. I interviewed everyone who saw Caleb that day. His friend Ethan was the last to see him around 3:30, walking toward the bus stop on Main Street. Mrs. Larson from the corner store thought she saw him talking to someone in a car around 4 o'clock, but it was dusk and she couldn't make out faces. Jose Garcia, a mechanic working on Main Street, saw a boy matching Caleb's description with 2 men around 3:50, but he was scared to come forward back then. Why was he scared? Bennett asked, making notes. Eleanor's voice dropped. Jose was a young immigrant in '99, working under the table. He didn't trust cops, especially in a small town like Pinewood, where everyone knew the police had their favorites. He didn't tell me what he saw until 2005, and by then his memory was hazy. Bennett studied the documents. What do you think happened to Caleb? Eleanor broke down completely. 22 years of suppressed anguish pouring out. I don't know. That's what's killing me. Was it random? Did he see something he shouldn't have? Was he targeted? I've imagined every possible scenario, and I still don't have answers. She sobbed into her hands. My baby could have been killed by strangers, by someone he knew, by police officers, by troublemakers from out of town. I've suspected everyone and no one because I have no proof. Daniel reached over and squeezed her shoulder. Mrs. Thompson, that's why we're here, to get those answers. Eleanor looked up at Bennett with desperate hope. Detective, will you help me find out who killed my son? I can't die without knowing. I promised Caleb I'd find the truth, and I'm running out of time. Bennett leaned forward, her voice firm with conviction. Mrs. Thompson, I'm officially reopening Caleb's case. We're going to find out what happened to your son. 3 days after meeting Bennett, Eleanor's phone rang at 2 a.m. She fumbled for it, squinting at the caller ID. Unknown number. Hello, she answered, her voice groggy. Heavy breathing filled the line. Then a distorted voice rasped, Stop digging up the past, lady. Some things are better left buried. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Who is this? What do you want? Forget the jersey. Forget your son, or you'll join him. The line went dead. Eleanor sat in her dark bedroom, clutching the phone, her body trembling. After 22 years of searching, someone was scared enough to threaten her. It meant she was close to something dangerous. The next morning, she found a dead raccoon on her front porch, its body stiff, eyes glassy. A note was pinned to it. Back off. Her heart pounded, but her resolve hardened. Whoever did this knew she was getting closer to the truth. This isn't right, Daniel said when he arrived an hour later, responding to her panicked call. He stared at the raccoon, his face grim. We need to call Detective Bennett. I already did. She's on her way, Eleanor said, standing in her doorway, refusing to be cowed despite the fear in her eyes. Don't you see what this means? Someone knows we're investigating. Someone powerful enough to get my number. Someone who's been watching. Mrs. Thompson, maybe we should slow down, Daniel said cautiously. Slow down? Eleanor's voice exploded with fury. Mr. Rivera, someone just threatened to kill me because I'm trying to find out who murdered my son. That tells me we're on the right track. Bennett arrived within the hour, photographing the raccoon and the note. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be honest. This escalation concerns me. Maybe you should consider backing off until we have more resources. Backing off? Eleanor's eyes blazed. Detective, with all due respect, I've waited 22 years for someone to take my son's case seriously. Now that someone's scared enough to threaten me, you want me to quit? I want you to stay alive, Bennett said firmly. I've been dead inside for 22 years, Eleanor replied, her voice cracking with raw emotion. My baby was taken from me, and whoever did it has been walking free all this time. They think they can scare me into silence like they did in 1999. They picked the wrong mother." She turned to Daniel and Bennett, her resolve hardening. "Someone killed my child and thought they got away with it. Now they're panicking. Good. Let them panic." That afternoon, Eleanor made a bold decision. She called her sister, Pastor Mary Collins, and asked to hold a community meeting at Pinewood Community Church. "Eleanor, are you sure about this?" Mary asked, as they set up chairs in the fellowship hall. "Going public might put you in more danger." "I'm already in danger," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. "I've been in danger since the day Caleb disappeared. But I'm not the only mother in this town who's lost a child and never got answers." That evening, 60 people filled the fellowship hall. Eleanor stood at the front, Caleb's jersey spread on a table beside her, and told her story. She spoke of the jersey found in the mountains, the threatening calls, the dead raccoon, and her certainty that someone was trying to stop her investigation. "How many of you have lost children to violence?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with pain. "How many of you never got real answers?" Hands went up throughout the room, mothers, fathers, grandparents, all carrying the same grief Eleanor knew too well. "My son Caleb was murdered 22 years ago," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Someone buried his clothes in the Cascades and thought they'd buried the truth with them. But truth has a way of coming to light." An older woman in the front row stood. "My daughter, Emily, disappeared in 2000. Police said she ran away too." Another voice called out, "My nephew, Nate, in 2002. They never found his body." One by one, families shared their stories of children lost and investigations that went nowhere. Eleanor listened, her heart breaking and her resolve strengthening simultaneously. "This is bigger than just Caleb," she said finally. "This is about a pattern of our children disappearing and nobody caring enough to find the truth." She looked around at the grieving faces. "Well, I care, and I'm not stopping until I find out who killed my son, even if it kills me." The room erupted in applause, but Eleanor saw fear in their eyes too. Fear of retaliation, fear of what the truth might reveal, fear of hoping too much after decades of disappointment. For the first time in 22 years, though, Eleanor didn't feel alone in her fight. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the state police station with a fresh notebook and a list of community contacts from the church meeting. "Detective Bennett, I've been thinking about this all wrong," she said, settling into a chair across from Bennett's desk. "For 22 years, I've been asking what happened to Caleb. The real question is, who had contact with him that day?" Bennett nodded. "That's exactly the approach we need. Let's build a timeline of everyone who saw or spoke to Caleb on October 12th, 1999. Eleanor opened her notebook, its pages filled with names and notes accumulated over decades. "I've interviewed dozens of people over the years, but I want to go through them systematically this time. No more scattered searching. Start from the beginning. Who was the first person to see Caleb that day?" "You," Bennett said. "You," Bennett said. Eleanor's voice softened. "He came into the kitchen around 7:30 for breakfast, excited about basketball tryouts, talking about his dreams of playing for the Trailblazers. He left the house at 7:45 to catch the school bus." Bennett wrote notes as Eleanor continued. "His homeroom teacher, Ms. Harper, marked him present at 8:30 a.m. His friend Ethan sat with him at lunch and walked partway home with him after school around 3:15. That's when Ethan last saw him at the corner of Main and Oak. Ethan went east toward his house. Caleb continued north toward the bus stop." Eleanor traced the route on a photocopied map she'd studied countless times. "That's where the trail goes cold." "But you mentioned other witnesses," Bennett said. "Mrs. Larson from the corner store. She thought she saw Caleb around 4 o'clock, but she wasn't certain. The lighting was poor, and she only got a glimpse. Eleanor flipped pages in her notebook. Then there's Jose Garcia, the mechanic. He was working on a car on Main Street that day. What did Jose see? Bennett asked, her pen poised. Eleanor's voice grew intense. He saw a teenager matching Caleb's description talking to two men near a dark sedan around 3:50, just 20 minutes after Ethan last saw him. The boy looked nervous, like he wanted to run but couldn't. Did Jose describe the men? Bennett asked. That's where it gets complicated, Eleanor said, frustration evident. Jose was undocumented in 1999. He was terrified of police, especially in a small town where cops had a lot of sway. He didn't tell me what he saw until 2005, and by then he couldn't recall specific details about their appearance. Just that one was stocky, the other thin with glasses. Bennett made more notes. Anyone else? A few people mentioned seeing police cars in the area that afternoon, but that wasn't unusual. Mrs. Carter, who lived on Main, heard voices getting loud around 4:15, but didn't see anything. Eleanor's voice cracked. The hardest part is knowing someone out there saw what happened to my baby, but they either don't realize it or they're too scared to come forward. Why would they still be scared after all these years? Bennett asked. Eleanor met her eyes directly. Because whoever killed Caleb has power, real power. The kind that makes people disappear when they ask too many questions. The threat started the moment we reopened this case. Whoever did this has been watching, waiting, making sure the truth stays buried. Her voice hardened. But they made a mistake threatening me. It proves we're close to something they don't want found. She stood, gathering her papers. Detective, I want to re-interview every single person who might have seen Caleb that day. Someone knows more than they've said. Someone holds the key to finding out who killed my son. Where do we start? Bennett asked. With Jose Garcia, Eleanor said, her eyes blazing with renewed purpose. It's time he told us everything he remembers about those two men. Jose Garcia lived in a modest apartment in Eugene, a 30-minute drive from Pinewood. His weathered hands told the story of decades as a mechanic, now working at a small auto shop. When Eleanor and Detective Bennett knocked on his door, his face showed immediate recognition and fear. Mrs. Thompson, I told you everything I remember, he said nervously, glancing past them as if expecting to be watched. Jose, please, Eleanor said, her voice carrying both desperation and determination. You're the only person who saw Caleb with those men. My son's killer is still out there. Reluctantly, Jose let them inside. His small living room was filled with family photos, a crucifix on the wall, and a few lit candles. He sat heavily in a worn armchair, avoiding eye contact. The boy was scared. He began slowly. That's what I remember most. The way he kept looking around, like he wanted to run but couldn't. Bennett leaned forward. What about the men he was with? Older? White. One was big, like a football player. The other was thinner, had glasses and gray in his hair. Jose's voice dropped. They weren't just talking to the boy. They were interrogating him. Eleanor's heart raced. Interrogating him about what? I don't know, Jose said, his hands trembling as he reached for a glass of water. But the boy kept shaking his head, like he was saying no to something. Then the bigger man grabbed his arm, and the boy tried to pull away. Jose, Eleanor pressed. Did you see where they took him? He hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. Mrs. Thompson, there's something I never told you. Something I was too afraid to say. The room went silent. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair. That morning, before I saw the boy with those men, I saw something else. His voice was barely a whisper. There was a deal happening. Drugs, money, changing hands. Right there on Main Street in broad daylight. Bennett sat up straighter. Who was involved in the deal? Two men in suits, Jose said. They looked official, like they had authority, but they weren't in uniform. They were buying, not arresting. One had a scar on his jaw. The other kept checking his watch, nervous-like. When the deal was done, the one with the scar noticed me watching. He pointed at me, said something to his partner. That's when I got scared and went back to work. Eleanor felt her world shift. Jose, are you saying Caleb might have seen this drug deal? The boy came walking down that street maybe 15 minutes later, Jose said, his voice shaking. If those men were still around, he couldn't finish. Oh God, Eleanor breathed, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Caleb saw something he shouldn't have seen. Bennett's voice was tight with controlled anger. Jose, can you describe these men in suits more specifically? The bigger one, the one with the scar, had a deep voice, like he was used to giving orders. The other was thinner, wore glasses, kept fidgeting. They didn't look like dealers, more like cops or officials. Jose paused, then added reluctantly, Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. I saw a police car parked around the corner. I thought maybe it was backup for the deal, like they were all working together. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window. My baby was killed because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw corrupt officials dealing drugs, and they murdered him to keep him quiet. Mrs. Thompson, we need to be careful about assumptions, Bennett warned. No, Eleanor said, spinning around, her voice filled with anguish. Don't you see? This is why the original investigation went nowhere. This is why witnesses disappeared. This is why I've been threatened. Tears streamed down her face. My 13-year-old son was murdered because he witnessed corruption, and the system covered it up for 22 years. Jose buried his face in his hands. I should have come forward. Maybe if I had. They would have killed you too, Eleanor said quietly, her anger shifting to heartbreak. They were willing to murder a child to protect their secret. They wouldn't have hesitated to silence a witness. She turned to Bennett with desperate eyes. Detective, how many other witnesses do you think they've eliminated over the years? The threats escalated that very night. Eleanor's car windows were smashed, and "Stop" was spray-painted in red across her garage door. Her wildflower garden was uprooted, every plant trampled into the dirt. When she woke to the destruction the next morning, something inside her snapped. That's it, she screamed, standing amid the ruins of her carefully tended garden. You want to threaten me? You want to destroy everything I care about? You already took the most important thing in my life. Daniel arrived to find Eleanor sitting on her front steps, surrounded by the wreckage, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a photo of Caleb. Mrs. Thompson, maybe it's time to consider. Don't, she cut him off, her voice raw. Don't you dare suggest I give up. Not when we're this close to the truth. But even as she said it, the weight of 22 years crashed down on her. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, not the quiet tears she'd shed over the years, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from her soul. I'm so tired, she whispered between gasps. I'm so damn tired of fighting for justice that should have been given freely. I'm tired of being strong when all I want is my baby back. Daniel sat beside her on the steps. No one would blame you if you needed to stop. But Caleb would blame me, Eleanor said, her voice cracking. Every night for 22 years, I've promised his picture I wouldn't give up. How can I break that promise now? She stood suddenly, pacing in front of her destroyed garden. They killed my 13-year-old son because he saw something he shouldn't have. Then they buried him like garbage and let me spend 22 years wondering if he was alive, if he was hurt, if he was calling for me. Her voice rose to a shout. They let me blame myself. They let me wonder if I could have protected him. They watched me tear myself apart with guilt and grief, and they said nothing. Pastor Mary Collins, Eleanor's sister, arrived just as she reached her breaking point. Eleanor, "What's going on here?" Mary asked, taking in the smashed windows, the vandalized garage, her sister's tear-stained face. "They destroyed my garden," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with fury. "Someone's trying to intimidate me into stopping the investigation." Mary placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maybe the Lord is telling you to pause." "Don't," Eleanor whirled on her, fury blazing in her eyes. "Don't you dare tell me this is God's will. God didn't kill my son. Evil men did. And God didn't spend 22 years covering it up. Corrupt officials did." She collapsed against her sister, finally letting herself be vulnerable. "I'm scared, Mary. I'm so scared. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life not knowing who killed Caleb and why." Mary held her as she cried. "What do you need from me?" "I need my church family," Eleanor said, wiping her tears with determination. "I need people who will stand with me when these killers try to silence me." "You have us," Mary said. "You've always had us." "Then I'm going public with everything we've learned," Eleanor declared. "If they want to threaten me, let them do it in front of the whole town. Let them explain why they're so desperate to keep a 22-year-old murder case quiet." Daniel looked concerned. "Mrs. Thompson, that could put you in serious danger." "I've been in danger since the day I started asking questions about Caleb's disappearance," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. "But they made a mistake when they decided to threaten me. Because now, I know for certain, we're on the right track." She looked at Daniel and Mary with fierce determination. "They're scared, and they should be, because I'm not backing down until everyone knows what they did to my son." Eleanor's decision to go public sent shockwaves through Pinewood. Portland's KGW News ran her story as their lead segment. Mother's 22-year search for justice. New evidence in cold case murder. Eleanor sat across from reporter Lisa Nguyen, Caleb's jersey displayed prominently between them. "Mrs. Thompson, you believe your son witnessed corruption and was killed to silence him," Lisa said. "That's a serious allegation." "It's not an allegation. It's the truth," Eleanor said, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with conviction. "My son Caleb was murdered because corrupt officials couldn't let him live with what he'd seen. They buried his body like he was nothing, then spent 22 years watching me suffer." The story spread across social media within hours. Justice for Caleb began trending on X. Eleanor's phone buzzed constantly, reporters requesting interviews, community activists offering support, and anonymous callers making threats. That evening, as she sat in her living room answering emails from supporters, her phone rang again. The caller ID showed unknown number. "Mrs. Thompson," a different voice this time, older, more direct. "You're making a big mistake." "Who is this?" Eleanor demanded, her heart pounding. "You think you're close to the truth, but you're about to destroy innocent people's lives. Mitchell and Hayes are good men who served this town with honor. Your son was a troublemaker who got in over his head." "My son was 13 years old," Eleanor shouted into the phone. "An honor roll student who dreamed of playing basketball. How dare you?" "Face the facts, lady. Your boy was in the wrong place at the wrong time because he was messing with drugs. Those officers tried to help him, and things went wrong." "You're lying." Eleanor's rage consumed her. "You're all liars. Drop this crusade, or more people will get hurt. And we know where your sister's church is. Be a shame if something happened during Sunday service." The line went dead. Eleanor stared at the phone, shaking with fury and terror. "They just threatened Mary's church," she told Daniel when he arrived minutes later, summoned by her frantic text. "They threatened innocent people just because they're supporting me." Bennett was at Eleanor's door within the hour. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to talk about security measures. They threatened your church." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice hollow with shock. "And they named Mitchell and Hayes. details never made public. Bennett sat down heavily. There's something else. The call came from a burner phone, but we're working on it. Mentioning those names means whoever called you knows specific details about the investigation. Eleanor's eyes widened. They're involved, aren't they? Mitchell and Hayes, or someone protecting them. It's likely, Bennett said. We're dealing with people who were directly involved in your son's murder. The weight of that realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. They're still out there, still covering for each other, still protecting themselves. But they're panicking. She stood, pacing to Caleb's photograph. Detective, what if they hurt people from my church? What if I'm putting innocent lives at risk? What if you stop now and let them get away with murdering your son? Bennett countered. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Continue fighting and risk others' lives, or surrender and let Caleb's killers walk free forever. When she opened her eyes, her resolve had crystallized. My son died because he accidentally witnessed corruption. I won't let his death be meaningless by backing down now. She turned to Bennett with fierce determination. Mitchell and Hayes, I want to know everything about them. Where they are now, what they're doing, who they're connected to. That call tonight just gave us our first real lead in 22 years. Eleanor's relentless research into Mitchell and Hayes led to a breakthrough. After hours of scouring online records, old newspaper archives, and making phone calls to former colleagues, she discovered that Thomas Hayes had died of a stroke in 2015, leaving behind a widow, Margaret Hayes, who lived in a retirement community in Salem. I found her address, Eleanor told Bennett the next morning, holding a piece of paper with trembling hands. Margaret Hayes lives at Willow Creek Senior Living. I want to talk to her. Mrs. Thompson, approaching a widow about her deceased husband's potential crimes is delicate territory, Bennett cautioned. Detective, that woman might be the only person left who knows what really happened to Caleb, Eleanor said, her voice firm with resolve. I'm going to Salem today, with or without you. 2 hours later, Eleanor stood on Margaret Hayes' doorstep in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The woman who answered was in her late 60s, frail and using a cane, her eyes showing immediate recognition when Eleanor introduced herself. You're Caleb Thompson's mother, Margaret said quietly. I saw you on the news. Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you about your husband, Thomas. About October 1999, Eleanor said, her voice steady but insistent. Margaret's face paled, and she glanced around the neighborhood as if someone might be watching. I don't know what you're talking about. Tom was a good officer. He served Pinewood with honor. Eleanor stepped closer. Mrs. Hayes, please. My son has been gone for 22 years. I just need to know what happened to him. Your son was a runaway, Margaret said, her voice trembling. That's what the police reports said. The police reports were lies, Eleanor said, her voice cracking with desperation. Mrs. Hayes, I can see it in your eyes. You know something. I'm begging you, as one mother to another. Margaret's hands shook on her cane. Mrs. Thompson, I think you should leave. I can't help you. But Eleanor had spent 22 years reading people's faces, learning to see past their words to the truth beneath. Margaret Hayes was terrified, but she was also carrying a burden that was eating her alive. Your husband changed after 1999, didn't he? Eleanor pressed gently. Something happened that October that haunted him for the rest of his life. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Tom never talked about work at home. But he did, didn't he? Eleanor said, her voice growing urgent. In his sleep, when he'd been drinking, when the guilt became too much to bear. Mrs. Hayes, I've spent 22 years living in hell, not knowing if my son is alive or dead, if he's suffering somewhere, if he needed me. Please don't let me die without knowing the truth. Margaret backed away, shaking her head. You don't understand. There are people, dangerous people, who don't want these questions asked. What people? Eleanor asked. What are you afraid of? Nothing. I'm not afraid of anything, Margaret said, her voice high and panicked. Tom served this town honorably for 25 years. He was a good man. Who? Eleanor interrupted. Who did something in October 1999 that destroyed his peace of mind for the rest of his life? Margaret turned away, her shoulders shaking. Please leave, she whispered. I can't leave, Eleanor said, her voice breaking with raw emotion. Not when I'm this close to the truth about Caleb. I've spent 22 years searching for my son. I've knocked on thousands of doors, followed hundreds of leads, cried myself to sleep more nights than I can count. I have maybe 10 good years left, and I will not, die without knowing what happened to my baby. Margaret's resolve was crumbling. You don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking for the truth, Eleanor said. I'm asking for closure. I'm asking for the chance to finally lay my son to rest. She stepped closer, her voice filled with passionate desperation. Mrs. Hayes, you're a mother too. You have children, grandchildren. How would you feel if one of them disappeared and someone who knew what happened refused to tell you? That's different, Margaret said weakly. No, it's not, Eleanor said, her voice exploding with pain and fury. It's exactly the same. Your husband knew what happened to my son, and now you know too. You're keeping a mother from her child. Margaret began sobbing, her fragile composure shattering. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to keep it hidden, but I was afraid. Afraid of who? Eleanor pressed, her voice softening but still urgent. Mitchell, Margaret said, her voice audible above her sobs. Carl Mitchell. He's still alive, still has friends in the department. Tom was terrified of him, even after they retired. Said Mitchell would kill anyone who threatened to expose what they did. Eleanor felt her heart stop. What did they do, Mrs. Hayes? What did Mitchell and your husband do to Caleb? Margaret collapsed into a chair, the weight of 22 years crushing her. Tom wasn't a bad man. He was weak, but not evil like Mitchell. Her voice was barely audible. They were taking money from drug dealers, protection money. Tom said it started small, just looking the other way on minor deals. But it grew bigger, more dangerous. And Caleb saw something he shouldn't have, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. Margaret nodded miserably. Tom said your son witnessed a big drug buy, saw Mitchell taking money from a dealer named Carson. Caleb recognized Mitchell from a school safety talk. Mitchell panicked when the boy threatened to tell his mother. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. After 22 years of wondering, the truth was more brutal than her worst nightmares. Where is my son's body, Mrs. Hayes? Margaret sobbed uncontrollably. Tom kept records. He was paranoid Mitchell would kill him too. He documented everything as insurance. She struggled to her feet and disappeared down a hallway, returning with a small metal box. Your son didn't deserve what happened to him, and you didn't deserve to suffer for 22 years not knowing. She handed Eleanor the box with trembling hands. Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't come forward sooner. Eleanor opened the box to find a leather-bound notebook, photographs, and several cassette tapes. The first entry in the notebook was dated 3 months before Hayes' death in 2015. I can't sleep anymore. Every night I see that boy's face. Caleb Thompson, 13 years old. Mitchell shot him in cold blood, and I helped bury the body. God forgive me. I helped cover up the murder of a child. Eleanor's hands shook as she read on, 22 years of questions finally answered. But the truth was more devastating than she'd ever imagined. "Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly, "will you help me make sure Mitchell pays for what he did to my son?" Margaret nodded through her tears. It's time. Tom would want the truth to come out. He carried that guilt to his grave. Eleanor sat in her car outside Margaret Hayes' house for 20 minutes, staring at the metal box on the passenger seat. 22 years of searching, and the answers had been hidden in a Salem attic the entire time. Her hands trembled as she dialed Detective Bennett. "Detective, I have it. I have everything." "Mrs. Thompson, what do you mean?" Bennett asked, her voice tense. "Hayes' widow gave me his confession," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out. "A notebook, photographs, audio recordings. Mitchell killed my baby. He shot Caleb in the back and buried him in the mountains." Bennett's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Mrs. Thompson, are you safe?" "Where are you?" "I'm safe. I'm coming to the station now." Eleanor started her car with shaking hands. "Detective, after all these years of not knowing, I finally understand what happened to my son, and it's worse than anything I imagined." As she drove back to Pinewood, Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and devastation. Relief that the search was finally over, that she had proof of what happened to Caleb. Devastation at learning the brutal details of his final moments, running for his life through the mountains, shot in the back by a man sworn to protect and serve. She pulled over at a rest stop and opened Hayes' notebook again, reading his anguished words. Mitchell said the boy would ruin everything. Our careers, our pensions, our families would be destroyed if Caleb talked. I wanted to find another way, but Mitchell was already reaching for his gun. When Caleb started running, Mitchell didn't hesitate. One shot to the back. The boy fell face first into the dirt and never moved again. Eleanor closed the notebook and wept for her son's terror, for the 22 years she'd spent wondering, for the justice denied for so long. But beneath the grief was a fierce satisfaction that Mitchell's time of hiding was over. 300 miles away in Boise, Idaho, Carl Mitchell was drowning in paranoia and guilt. Ever since Eleanor Thompson appeared on KGW News with that damned Trailblazers jersey, his carefully constructed life had been unraveling. He'd barely slept in weeks, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking his security cameras obsessively. The threatening phone calls he'd made to Eleanor had been desperate, impulsive acts he regretted immediately. He'd used voice changers and burner phones to hide his identity, but each call only deepened his panic. He'd driven to Pinewood one drunken night, smashing her car windows and uprooting her garden in a futile attempt to scare her into silence. All he'd done was prove someone powerful was desperate to keep the truth buried. Mitchell poured another whiskey, his fourth that afternoon. The alcohol dulled the edges of his conscience, but couldn't silence Hayes' voice echoing in his memory. "We can't kill a kid, Carl. We can't cross that line." But they had crossed it. Mitchell had crossed it. One moment of panic, one split-second decision to protect his pension and reputation, and he'd murdered a 13-year-old boy in cold blood. The worst part was Hayes' late-life remorse. During his final weeks in the hospital, Hayes had rambled about confession, about making things right with God. Mitchell thought he'd talked him out of it, convinced him their families would be destroyed if the truth came out. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Mitchell walked to his bedroom window, peering through the blinds at the quiet suburban street. Kids rode bikes, neighbors watered lawns. The mailman made his rounds. Everything looked normal, but Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that someone was coming for him. His threatening calls to Eleanor, telling her to drop the investigation, threatening her sister's church, were like something out of a bad movie, desperate acts of a guilty man losing control. His phone rang, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. Unknown number. "Hello," he answered, his voice tight. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Detective Laura Bennett with the Oregon State Police. I'd like to ask you some questions about a case you worked in 1999. Mitchell's blood turned to ice. "I'm retired, Detective. You'll need to go through proper channels if you want to discuss old cases. The case involves Caleb Thompson, a 13-year-old boy who disappeared on October 12, 1999. You and Officer Hayes were the investigating officers." "That was over 20 years ago," Mitchell said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I don't remember the details." "We've recently recovered physical evidence in Caleb Thompson's case," Bennett said. "We'd appreciate your cooperation in helping us understand what happened." Mitchell hung up without another word. They had evidence. Hayes must have kept records, documentation tying them to the murder. He grabbed his whiskey bottle and poured a larger glass, his mind racing through the mistakes he'd made in recent weeks. The threatening calls, the vandalism, the anonymous warnings that only proved someone was desperate. As a cop for 25 years, Mitchell knew criminals got caught because they panicked and did stupid things. And that's exactly what he'd been doing, acting like every guilty suspect he'd ever arrested. His doorbell rang, and Mitchell froze. Through the peephole, he saw two men in suits. FBI, he realized with sinking dread. Not local police, not state detectives, but federal agents. The game was over. "Carl Mitchell," a voice called through a bullhorn. "This is the FBI. Come out with your hands visible." Mitchell sank into his recliner, the whiskey glass slipping from his numb fingers to shatter on the hardwood floor. For 22 years, he'd lived with the weight of what he'd done to Caleb Thompson. In recent weeks, his guilt and paranoia had driven him to make mistake after mistake, threatening Eleanor, vandalizing her property, proving through his panic that he had something to hide. In his darkest moments, usually when drunk, he remembered Caleb's face in those final seconds, the terror in the boy's eyes as he realized they wouldn't let him go, the way he'd stumbled through the forest, crying, "Mom! Mom! Help me!" Those were Caleb's last words before Mitchell's bullet found its mark. Now Caleb's mother had found the truth. After 22 years, Eleanor Thompson had tracked down the evidence that would destroy him. Mitchell stood slowly, his arthritis making his movements stiff. Outside, the FBI agents were growing impatient. "I'm coming out," he called, opening his front door with hands raised. As agents swarmed him, pressing him against his car and reading his rights, Mitchell glimpsed a neighbor's TV through their window. Eleanor Thompson was on the screen, tears streaming down her face as she watched his arrest live on the news. "Carl Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of Caleb Thompson," Agent Rodriguez announced. For the first time in 22 years, Mitchell felt a twisted relief. The waiting was over. 3 months after Mitchell's arrest, the media circus surrounding the trial was relentless. Reporters camped outside the Portland courthouse, and legal analysts dissected every piece of evidence on cable news. Eleanor endured countless interviews, each forcing her to relive Caleb's murder. But she knew this was the price of justice. In the packed courtroom, as opening statements began, Eleanor felt 22 years of searching culminating in this moment. Every lead she'd followed, every sleepless night, every tear shed, it all came down to convincing 12 strangers that Carl Mitchell was a cold-blooded killer. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," District Attorney Rachel Kim began, 22 years ago, 13-year-old Caleb Thompson left for school, excited about basketball tryouts. He never came home because Officer Carl Mitchell murdered him to cover up police corruption. Kim laid out the prosecution's case methodically. Hayes' detailed notebook, the physical evidence from the duffel bag, Jose Garcia's eyewitness testimony, and Eleanor's decades of investigation. But Eleanor saw the challenge they faced. 22 years was a long time. Memories had faded, and key witnesses had died. Mitchell's defense attorney, Paul Grant, was equally methodical. The prosecution asks you to convict a decorated police officer based on the writings of a stroke-addled man who died 7 years ago and the theories of a grieving mother who's spent 2 decades blaming anyone she can for her son's disappearance. Grant painted Hayes as an unreliable narrator, his guilt over unrelated corruption leading to exaggerated confessions. He questioned the chain of custody for the buried evidence and suggested Eleanor's investigation was so single-minded she'd ignored alternative explanations, like Caleb running away or getting caught in unrelated trouble. As the trial progressed over weeks, Eleanor watched the jury closely. Some seemed moved by her testimony about Caleb's character, his love for basketball, his honor roll grades, his volunteering at church. Others appeared skeptical when Grant cross-examined her about her amateur investigative methods. A middle-aged woman in the front row nodded sympathetically when Eleanor described the police's initial dismissal, but an older man in the back seemed swayed by Grant's arguments about reasonable doubt. Jose Garcia took the stand, testifying about seeing Caleb with 2 men, but Grant's cross-examination exposed gaps in his memory and his initial reluctance to come forward. Margaret Hayes testified about finding her husband's confession materials, but Grant suggested she might have misunderstood Tom's guilt over other matters. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the case teetering on a knife's edge. During a recess in the 3rd week, Eleanor found herself in the courthouse hallway when Mitchell emerged from the men's room, briefly separated from his legal team. For 22 years, she'd imagined this moment, being alone with her son's killer. "Carl Mitchell," she said quietly, stepping toward him. He turned, his face showing weariness. "Mrs. Thompson, we shouldn't be talking without our attorneys." "I don't care what you think," Eleanor said, her voice low but intense. "I've been waiting 22 years to tell you exactly what I think of you." Mitchell glanced around nervously. "This isn't appropriate." "Appropriate?" Eleanor's voice rose. "Was it appropriate when you murdered my 13-year-old son?" Heads turned in the hallway. "The jury will decide," Mitchell said, his voice unsteady. "The jury doesn't know you like I know you," Eleanor interrupted, stepping closer until he backed against the wall. "I've spent 22 years studying every detail of what you did to Caleb. I know exactly what kind of monster you are." Mitchell's face flushed. "I'm not a monster. I was a good cop." "You're a child killer," Eleanor's voice echoed, drawing more stares. "You murdered an innocent boy to protect your drug money. Then you spent 22 years watching me suffer while you lived free." "Keep your voice down," Mitchell hissed, uncomfortable with the attention. "Why? Are you ashamed to have people know what you are?" Eleanor's eyes blazed. "A coward who shoots children in the back?" She stepped closer. "You know what I've thought about every day for 22 years? My son's final moments. How scared he must have been when he realized you weren't going to let him go home." "Mrs. Thompson, please," Mitchell said, his voice breaking. "Please what? Stop telling the truth?" Eleanor's voice built in intensity. "Caleb was terrified, wasn't he? He called for me, didn't he? He died calling for his mama while you and Hayes decided his life was worth less than your pension." Mitchell's composure cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I know you forced my baby into your car and drove him to the mountains like a criminal. I know when he tried to run for his life, you shot him in the back like an animal." "Stop it," Mitchell whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Why? Does the truth make you uncomfortable?" Eleanor leaned in close. "For 22 years, I've wondered if Caleb suffered, if he was in pain, if he understood what was happening. Now I know he died in terror because of you." Mitchell was trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." "But it did happen like that," Eleanor said, her control snapping. "You made it happen. You looked into the eyes of a scared child and decided he had to die. You're not a police officer. You're a murderer." "I know," Mitchell broke down, his voice cracking. "God help me. I know what I did." Eleanor stared at the broken man who destroyed her life. "You took everything from me. My son, my peace, my faith in justice. You're the worst kind of monster, one who hides behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." She leaned closer, her voice filled with 22 years of rage. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, you'll never be free from what you did to Caleb. You'll carry that guilt until you die, and even then, it won't be enough." Mitchell slumped against the wall, sobbing. Before he could respond, his attorneys appeared, rushing to separate them. "Mrs. Thompson, you cannot speak to our client," Paul Grant said sternly. "I'm done talking to him," Eleanor replied, her voice steady again. "I've said everything I needed to say." She walked away, leaving Mitchell shattered against the courthouse wall. When the trial resumed, Mitchell seemed different, withdrawn, less confident. His attorneys prompted him to sit up straight, but Eleanor noticed he kept glancing at her with haunted eyes. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful, with Rachel Kim weaving the evidence into a compelling narrative. Caleb Thompson died because he witnessed police corruption, and Carl Mitchell chose to silence him permanently rather than face the consequences. Grant's closing emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence and reliance on circumstantial proof. You cannot convict a man of murder based on speculation and the writings of a dead man, no matter how tragic Caleb Thompson's disappearance may be. When the jury retired for deliberations, Eleanor felt her life hanging in the balance. 5 hours later, they returned. "Has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" Judge Morrison asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. Eleanor held her breath, 22 years of hope and pain crystallizing into this moment. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and sobs of relief. Eleanor collapsed into Daniel's arms, overwhelmed by the realization that Caleb had finally received justice. Across the courtroom, Mitchell sat stunned as his attorneys discussed appeals. Judge Morrison sentenced him to life in prison without parole. As Mitchell was led away in shackles, he looked back at Eleanor one last time. She met his gaze without flinching, knowing her son's killer would never hurt another child. 6 months after Mitchell's conviction, Eleanor stood in the bright morning sunlight at Pinewood Cemetery, holding a simple bronze marker. Caleb Thompson, beloved son, 1986 to 1999. His spirit shines on. After 22 years of not knowing where her son rested, she finally had a place to say goodbye. A 3-week search in the Cascade Mountains, guided by Hayes' notebook and Mitchell's confession, had located Caleb's remains exactly where the documents indicated. Eleanor had been there when they found him, clutching Daniel's hand as the forensic team excavated what was left of her boy. "He's coming home, Mrs. Thompson," Bennett had said quietly that day. "Caleb is finally coming home." Now, as cemetery workers installed the headstone, Eleanor knelt and placed a fresh Trailblazers jersey beside it, the same red as the one he'd worn the day he disappeared. "I kept my promise, baby," she whispered, her voice strong despite the tears. "I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up." Pastor Mary approached, placing a gentle hand on her sister's shoulder. "Caleb would be so proud of you, Eleanor. You never let the world forget him." "I couldn't let them get away with it," Eleanor replied, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "My son deserved justice, and every other child who might have been next deserved protection." The Caleb Thompson Foundation was established within weeks of Mitchell's sentencing. Donations poured in from across the country. Families who'd lost children, activists inspired by Eleanor's story, and ordinary people moved by her 22-year fight. Daniel, who'd become like a son to Eleanor, served as the foundation's volunteer coordinator. "We've helped locate 4 missing children," he reported during a weekly meeting. "The database you created of investigative techniques is being used nationwide. The foundation's office in Pinewood's modest downtown buzzed with activity. Volunteers helped families navigate police bureaucracy, provided resources for private searches, and connected grieving parents with support groups. Margaret Hayes became an unexpected ally, using her late husband's pension to fund the foundation's work. Tom would want his guilt to serve some purpose, she told Eleanor during a monthly meeting. Maybe helping others will balance some of the harm we caused. Detective Bennett, promoted to captain after closing several cold cases inspired by Eleanor's methods, visited regularly. "You've changed how we approach these investigations," she told Eleanor. The department implemented new protocols for missing persons cases, especially involving children. Unofficially called Caleb's Rules, they mandated thorough witness interviews, proper evidence preservation, and follow-ups for cases initially classified as runaways. Eleanor's story sparked broader conversations about police accountability. The Oregonian ran a 5-part series examining unsolved cases from the 1990s, several now reopened. "Mitchell wasn't working alone," Eleanor said in a TV interview 6 months post-trial. "There were other officers involved in corruption, other cases that deserve scrutiny. Caleb's story is about systemic failures that let killers hide behind badges." Interview requests never stopped, but Eleanor was selective, focusing on the foundation rather than reliving her trauma. "Some reporters want to sensationalize Caleb's story," she told Daniel. "But this isn't about me anymore. It's about ensuring no other mother fights 22 years for answers." Daniel had become family, visiting every Sunday for dinner and helping with foundation business. "You saved my life too," he told her one evening over lasagna. "Finding that jersey, meeting you, it gave my life purpose I didn't know I was missing." "Caleb brought you to me," Eleanor said with a smile. "My baby's still taking care of his mama." The foundation's scholarship program awarded college funding to Pinewood youth who showed academic excellence and community involvement, the kind of kids Caleb would have befriended. At the first scholarship ceremony, Eleanor addressed the recipients. Caleb dreamed of playing for the Trailblazers, but his real dream was bigger. He wanted to make his community proud, to show the world that kids from small towns like Pinewood could achieve anything. "You are living his dream." Mitchell's appeals were denied. He would spend his life in prison. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only relief that he could never harm again. Driving home from the cemetery, she passed the corner of Main and Oak, where Caleb was last seen. For the first time in 22 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of unanswered questions. She felt peace. Caleb Thompson was home. His story had sparked change to protect other children. His mother's promise was kept. The fight for justice was over, but the fight to honor his memory would continue for the rest of Eleanor's life. And that felt exactly right.